Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom. Good afternoon, my name is Sebastian Mahfood, and welcome to Faith and Science in Catholic Schools, a program of the Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology, in partnership with WCAT Radio out of St. Louis, Missouri. And I would like to introduce to you Stacy Transancos, who is a chemist, and Mikki Sciba, who is a theologian. Welcome both of you to today's interview.
Thank you for having us.
It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you so very much for joining us today. Well, let's begin with Stacy Transancos. She's a chemist. Stacy, could you tell us something about yourself?
Yes, my background is in chemistry, but I'm a wife and mother of 7 and studied theology at Holy Apostles College and Seminary while I was home being open to life and chasing toddlers around the house. And when I finished that, I began teaching online courses for Holy Apostles and for Seton Hall, and then for Colby Academy at the high school level, teaching chemistry and physics. And now I'm the executive director of Bishop Strickland's St. Philip Institute in the Diocese of Tyler, Texas, and we're teaching the faith to people and evangelizing, leading people to heaven, God willing, every day of our lives.
And Mikki?
My name is Mikki Sciba. I got a bachelor's degree in theology, youth ministry, and philosophy from Benedictine College, and I've worked with high schoolers ever since I graduated in 2005. I was a youth minister for a year, and then I taught freshman theology for 11 years in the Catholic school system. I have 3 young children of my own, a 9-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 3-year-old. And just this past year, by God's design, ended up at the St. Philip Institute here in Tyler, doing faith formation for our youngest of Catholic parishioners.
So, if I'm hearing you right, we have a scientist and a theologian, both advancing the faith in the same catechetical institute in the Diocese of Tyler. In your teaching, how do you advance the faith in regards to the relationship with science and technology? Sometimes science courses, or within science courses, the students will ask, well, teacher, if the science explains the origins of the universe and the origins of everything, why do we need God? And in other classes, the students may say, well, if God created all of this, what use is it to us of our science? Do you ever, in your interactions with your students, come across questions like these, and how would you address them?
Okay, well, in my background with chemistry, I was a chemistry teacher before I was even religious. And so I used to sort of deal with questions like that, not specifically because I didn't really care about the religion question. All I cared about was the science question. I wanted to teach my high school students back in the 90s to learn to know chemistry. But there was always the problem of when they said, why do I have to know this? I would just say, because the state requires it, because you want to get into college, because you have to, because you want to get an A. And it was really an unsatisfying answer. My students knew it. I knew it. To make a long story short, years later after I converted, and it occurred to me that science is the study of the handiwork of God. That's the tagline of my life. That science is the study of the handiwork of God, and that creation was God's first revelation to us. Then I taught high school chemistry again at a Catholic school, Colby Academy in Napa, California, and I had a whole different reason to explain to students why they needed to learn chemistry, because it was getting to know God better through the study of his handiwork so that you can love God more. In a way, it was like worship in the sense of being in awe of God and in awe of creation and what God did. So that's a much better reason to study science.
And a much better response for students who are looking for reasons of their own.
I still hear from students. I stopped teaching there over a year ago, and I still hear from students regularly who have decided to become scientists.
That's really cool.
Catholic students.
But that's the scientist approach to this. So basically, if I hear you correctly, it's possible to encounter God through our discovery of the world that He created.
Yes.
To understand the Creator better, or at least enter into a greater, perhaps, relationship with that Creator, if we know something about what it is that He has created, which is the effects that we see all around us. How would you approach it, Mikki?
It's so funny because I feel like Stacy and I's stories are completely different because growing up I didn't care about science. Of course I didn't have a teacher explaining why it's important and how we can understand God better. But I grew up, I had a pretty strong conversion experience in high school, and I just fell in love with God. And I was just sort of very trusting in the church's teachings, and but I didn't, I must confess, like, I feel like it's completely opposite stories. I did not like science class. Most of probably what my teachers spent years studying and trying to teach me never stuck. And it wasn't until, I would say probably within the past couple of years, that I've really understood this dynamic of recognizing the processes and the systems set in place and the way the world works, how it can just show you the magnificence of God. Like sometimes, and this is how I would explain it to my students, even though I couldn't tell them the beauty of the science and what that tells us about God, I told them what we can see is that there is beauty in this. And I would kind of think of like someone who makes fireworks, right? So I can see the firework go off and see all of the designs, and I may not know how they get the different colors or the different shapes, but I am in awe of the effects of the science of how they put that all together. Even though I didn't understand that, but I could recognize the beauty in that. And I feel, had there been someone who explained, like, this is what you see, but let me show you, like, how that works. And I think it would have helped me appreciate the things that I witnessed better. And I didn't necessarily have that growing up. So my love of science is growing because it wasn't something that I necessarily had. But when I taught my students, because I taught freshmen in high school, and when I taught my students that there is beauty in the world, and if you stop and just look at it, even though I couldn't explain the processes nearly as well as Stacy could, I could say, but this beauty, we know that it comes from the ultimate source of beauty, which is God. We see order. We see order in the universe, and even though I, as a religion teacher, couldn't explain all of the way that that order is reached or how it works, but we have order because there is this supreme being of order, and that's where it flows from. We see intelligence, that there are things that function intelligently, and we as human beings, and that comes from an intelligent creator, not just something random that was put together. And trying to lead them to that was my experience.
There's an atheist named Richard Dawkins who says, and he's one of the new atheists, the new atheist would say that all you really need to explain the universe is deep time. So from the time that we had an explosion in the Big Bang to the time that it took for those particles to form into some kind of mass that were productive of life, evolution itself explains creation, and therefore we don't need God. How would you respond to somebody who comes to you and says, "Teacher, evolution explains all this. We don't need God. We have that explanation already. Why are you trying to evangelize us on something that we don't need?"
I love going back to St. Thomas's 5 Proofs of God's Existence. It's one of the things that we would study with my students, which for freshmen was kind of a little difficult for them to really dive into at some points. But that's one of the things I love to do, is to go through each of those and identify arguments within each of the 5 proofs. One of my favorite was, you can't have nothing and then something, right? Something can't come from nothing, and trying to get them to explore that, and they would have to write papers on exploring those ideas for themselves, because I would try so hard to find all different kinds of ways to teach St. Thomas Aquinas proofs. But for some reason, it wasn't sticking if they weren't and somehow engaged in that conversation, if that makes sense. And so that's one of the things that I would use, is that. But then I would also go a step further and say, but why? Like there's a significant difference between what something happens, like how something happens, and to why it happens. Like there are some things that science can never teach us. You know, even those deep-rooted questions that we experience in our own souls, like why are we here? Like we have those deep thoughts. Each individual does, why am I here? What am I supposed to do? We seek this deeper meaning of life, and science can never even answer the question, why do we experience this longing for purpose? And trying to get them to connect sort of some of their own experiences with things that they feel deep within themselves, and why science is just inadequate in sort of explaining those more philosophical ideas about purpose and why we exist.
If science isn't trying to explain that, why, Stacy, would the scientists think that what they can explain provides a comprehensive answer to our existence, and to our meaning and our purpose?
Because it's all they've got. You chain your intellect, literally, and I love to say this to atheists because they hate hearing that, but it challenges them. You chain your intellect if you say that science has all the answers, because you cannot admit into any of your arguments or your thinking or your view of the world a spiritual realm. You can't admit the existence of angels. You cannot admit the existence of God. You cannot admit, then, the existence of the human soul. And so I always kind of laugh when atheists say that they're the free thinkers, because how can you be a free thinker if everything that you think is just a function of atoms and molecules doing their things? You know, your free thinking is no more free thought than a water molecule that decides to be a raindrop, part of a raindrop in a crowd. It's just going with the flow. That the laws of nature force it to do. And so you cannot, you know, to get into the free will arguments, they say, and atheists say this, the most strident atheists, scientists, neuroscientists say this, that free will is an illusion. You can Google that and you can find all kinds of stuff about it. They actually do see the end of their arguments, that free will is an illusion. And they say that we just feel like we have free will because our deterministic nature makes us feel that way. And that's a really sad way to think about life. It means you're ultimately not responsible for anything. And I did think that way. I did buy into that thought, and it's very empty, because like my son said, what happens if you jump off of a cliff into nothingness? You miss dinner. You miss everything else about your life too. He was 4. But you miss everything else about your life too. And for me, one of the most powerful things about converting was accepting that there is more than the material realm, that there is a spiritual realm, and that I, a human person, have body and soul, am body and soul, and that I have the spiritual powers of intellect and free will that I understood from the Trinitarian doctrine. And that's how I'm made in the image and likeness of God. And that changes your life completely. You, instead of saying I was born to eat that taco today because my atoms and molecules led me to this point, you are in charge of your choices, and you are responsible for your choices. And it's a powerful thing. I mean, yes, if you're an atheist and you're converting, the hardest thing to do at first is to face your sins. But once you take that leap and you get past it and you start studying virtue in the systematic, rigorous ways that we are guided as Catholics towards happiness, it changes every morning you wake up. It's like Christmas and Easter wrapped all up into one, because you get to have that gift of each new day and figure out what you can do in your life.
Well, you bring up a couple of very excellent points. One is the scientific method is itself limited to recognizing and to exploring only those things that the scientific method is able to explore, which is basically an extension of our senses as they can be applied to the world. So why would a scientist, would be a follow-up question, think that the empirical method could answer those questions of why, or even address the question of how he or she, him or herself, is thinking at all. Because we may not have a way to say, I can only believe in what I can measure, yet I'm saying a sentence and thinking about something that my own tools themselves can't measure, namely my intellect, or namely my, as you were saying, that my will, my ability to make choices. But two, if you are not responsible for your choices, if it's just a matter of atoms interacting with atoms, then you are free from accountability. You can do anything you want. You don't have to worry about heaven above or hell below. So, is it possible that a secular society likes to pursue its own appetites more than it wants to be held accountable for the consequences of those pursuits?
It's a very troubling thing. Dr. Victor Stenger was one of the ones that argued about free will, and I remember after I converted and I was learning about free will and thinking about it and getting my head around that whole thing, because I know what they were saying when you say that free will is an illusion, because if your brain is just your atoms and molecules, you're making your neurons do what they do, the thoughts you have are just emergent from your material in your brain, your gray matter. And I was reading some of their arguments, because, you follow the logical trail. Where does this end? Where does this end? Okay, it doesn't end there by saying we have no free will. It gets back to what you were saying, Sebastian, about that you're not responsible for your choices. Victor Stenger had actually written an article that troubled me very much, because he said, okay, and I think Sam Harris wrote about this in his book, Free Will, too, but the societal consequences of denying free will are that when you have a criminal who kills mass murderers, he's not responsible for doing that. It's just that his brain was messed up, and, he was destined to do that from the beginning of time, because that's just the way the matter was going to go. He's no more dangerous than a rock that falls off of a cliff and hits a bunch of people and kills them. That's a function of the laws of nature. And so they were saying, what do you do with people like that who are a danger to society? You lock them up and kill them. It ultimately gets to a lack of dignity for human life. And so you lock him up. But then he had something in there that was chilling to me, was saying, and religious people are most likely to be the dangerous people. And so what's the next step? Lock them all up. Because if the people whose brains are making them be religious and buy into these silly religious stories and discriminate and be bigots and all of that, they were actually making an argument against Christians ultimately. And it's a scary thing, because when you have a whole society thinking like that, how do you convince them, I'm not dangerous, I'm a person of faith? It gets back to the stuff that was back in the Roman and Greek times, when after Christ came, and they were killing people for that. And it was chilling to me. And I also remember thinking, it's funny, because they're the ones who have no explanation for free thought, and we do. And they're kind of all standing around scratching their heads with their quagmire of ridiculous conclusions. Meanwhile, the Christians are the ones who get on with things and practice virtue and try to get to heaven. It's the atheists who are standing there scratching their heads, stuck.
Well, that's the beauty of our being as Catholics, faith and reason people.
Yeah.
We can think, and we apply not just our understanding to civil laws, but we map civil laws onto natural law. And natural law is the participation, as St. Thomas said, of the rational creature in the eternal law of God. Now, if we can participate in the eternal law of God, that means there's got to be something special about us, and it's got to be something relational about our being children of a Creator who loves us and wants a relationship with us, and calls us intentionally into that relationship with Him. What are your thoughts, Mikki, on this?
One of the quotes that I would use a lot was a quote from St. Augustine, that our hearts are restless until they rest in you, O Lord. And because I knew if I just started my class spitting out scripture or church teaching that, at least for my high schoolers, it wasn't something that would have sold them on faith. So I would start with them like an exploration of like, are you happy? And they would have to write. They would have to write about that. Like, what are they seeking? Are they restless? Are they peaceful? And we would have these conversations, because I think that at the core, at least of the students that I taught, and I taught many students who claim to be atheists. But when I would engage in conversation with them, they weren't actually what you would consider a true atheist. They're like, no, I don't believe in God, but some divine power, or that there's some spiritual force. And I'm like, well, then you're not really an atheist by definition. But they didn't know how to define where they were, right? Because they do, I think, we're made in the image and likeness of God. We desire relationship. We desire loving relationships. And so if I could point that out, we would study the Trinity and how we're made in the image and likeness of God, who is love. And this is across the board with every single human being that you find, regardless of culture, religion. Everyone desires that to love and to be loved. It's because we're made in the image and likeness of God. But even if people don't buy into the Trinity yet, they still, on a very personal level, experience that longing. And why is that the case? And I would kind of have them map out where they are. What is it that they feel? Right? When you are, and for my students, it was very basic. When you aren't in relationship, you are miserable. When you are in a good relationship, you are fulfilled. Why? That is what you're created for. You're created for that by a creator who made every single human who desires that, because that's the blueprint of how we're made. And I think slowly they started to understand that. And then once I was able to talk to my students who claimed to be atheists, most of them were not. Most of it is that they had a problem with something else, like a teaching, or they had a bad experience with someone who was a church leader or a teacher who wasn't very kind to them. And they're like, if that's what believing in God is like, I don't want to do that. So because I don't agree with their behavior, I can't be a believer. And so when I just started diving into a lot of just the individual questions my students had, it wasn't about whether or not a supreme being actually existed. Most of the time, it was an issue that wasn't explained to them, an experience that made them feel unloved. So helping them uncover that they do desire that intimate relationship of love. And they do that because we're longing for the Creator who made us for unconditional love. And most of the time, they were at least able to understand that. There were still only a few, I would say a handful of my students who said they were atheists, who would still argue like the atheistic views, right? And I guess what I would consider going to the extreme, of we have no free will. But in my experience, most of our young people are not. But they just don't know how to handle these different things. But I would approach it from more of their personal experience, and bring up St. Augustine. You are restless, and why? You are created for love, and you desire it. And even though no one's taught you that, I don't know how many of you have been taught, you were created in the image and likeness of God to love and to be loved. But once they realize that, oh my gosh, that is where I am, that it helps sort of bridge these big theological ideas with what they're actually experiencing at that moment.
If we look at your field, Mikki, and we look at your way in which you engage your students, the question of faith is a very easy one for you to bring into the classroom because you're a theology teacher. And if we look at Stacy and we say the question of science is also a very easy one for her to bring into the discussion because that's her topic. So what advice would either of you give the science person to the theology teacher on how to address questions of science in a theological classroom, especially when a student stands up and says, my science seems to have explained enough so that I don't really have to pay attention to this theology stuff that can't be measured by the tools that I've received in my physics classroom or my chemistry lab or wherever. And how would you, Mikki, advise a science teacher to address questions of faith in a classroom that where the students have shown up specifically perhaps for the purpose of learning how the mechanics work but not necessarily for the purpose of understanding that they're all God's mechanics.
Right. And I can say this from experience because it's definitely, I guess, something I was lacking in, right? So that I wish that I would have had more dialogue with the teachers who taught science in my class. Or like at the school that I was in, so that I actually knew what they were seeing, what they were hearing. I could anticipate some of their questions. But there's almost like we compartmentalize sort of disciplines in academics, which I understand has its benefit. But at least as far as if you're at an institution that is a Catholic institution or a Christian institution, having this interdisciplinary approach to the way that it's addressed. I have never seen a book that addresses, in one thing until now, that addresses theology and science in terms of like teaching curriculum for students. And I know there's organizations out there for high schoolers where you can pull in information. But when I first started, that was something, 11 years ago, and it could have just been my lack of not knowing what was out there. But I was almost on the defensive. Like anytime a student would come in, like I heard this in a religion class, I would just have to find, I learned this in science class, then I would just have to go to the theology and be like, if I knew the answer for my studies, point them to the catechism or scripture or church fathers or, but it wasn't a lot for me to just like, okay, I need to just learn the science of this so then I can figure out how to mold it together. And I wish it's something that I could have done a little bit more, should have paid more attention to. It's when we separate them. And it's like, well, science is here, religion is here, and then it's almost as if they're not brought in together, it's hard for the students to see how they are friends and not enemies. And if I could recommend anything, it would be to have those interdisciplinary conversations. And there might be textbooks out there that do that, but as far as like what teachers are teaching, what I should have done and what I wish I would have done is have regular conversations with the science teachers. Like, what are the kids asking? What are some things that you see as it relates to religion? Or what they would ask. Like, we're covering this in class, and I've had students ask me these theological questions, and I don't know the answer to. And I could tell the students, go ask your science teacher, because I don't know. But how much more, and sometimes they don't, because if you give them that option, then if we don't answer it when it's on their mind and when they ask, they may just not pursue it after that. And so I would just say a closer conversation, which I think has come a long way in the years that I was in it. And I remember going to a conference that really specifically talked about the issues that our young people were having with, they talk about evolution or creationism, and I remember a few years ago that was really something, and so my students were asking for somehow it made its way into the forefront of their minds, and that was a common question. And so I remember looking at some of the Magi Institute with Father Spitzer. I went to a talk of his which was mind-blowing, because I was like, I didn't know all this science, and I think that's when my love of, I wish I would have had a teacher who could have done both, mingled it a little bit better so that I could understand how the beauty of God manifests. And so I would just say that conversation between theologians and scientists.
Well, Christ gave us 2 commandments, right? He said, love God with all your mind, heart, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So learn to love the relationship that you have with God. Learn to love the relationship that you have with your fellow man. We, as humans, know things in their effects. God knows things as their cause. So if we understand the effects of God, we're understanding ways that we can interact with one another through those effects. And then the building of all kinds of wonderful things that continue to glorify and magnify our relationship with God. Now, you had referenced just now a book or some materials that are available for the faith-science conversation in our Catholic schools. And I happen to know someone who's in this conversation who's written these kinds of things. So, Stacy, would you like to give a plug for the work that you've done?
Yeah, I got involved with this work as a mother. I mean, I was a scientist, and then I was studying theology at Holy Apostles. But I was doing all of that so that I could explain the answers to my kids. So I wrote Particles of Faith with Ave Maria Press back in 2016, thinking with the audience before me was high school teachers and students and my children. And so now my book has been rewritten and is being republished before the fall of 2019 as a high school textbook with a 4, 8, and 16-week curriculum for teachers to use, both religion and science teachers to use in their courses as they want to. And I go around and speak now to help. I'm going to Archdiocese of San Francisco tomorrow to do something through the McGrath Institute at Notre Dame, which also had a grant to bring this conversation together. And so what they do in these talks, like I'm going to give, and we also had one here in Tyler as well, they bring the science and religion teachers together, and they host discussions and talks so that when they go back to their classrooms, the theology teacher doesn't need to know science, just needs to know science is the study of the handiwork of God. You're breaking your pencils over balancing chemical equations because God has created an ordered creation. So get over it, persevere, it's worth it. And that so the science teachers can say there's more than science to know about. There's science and faith. It's like a bigger reality, and we need philosophy to help us tie it all together. It's to give those kids a bigger vision of reality. So that I really do think we're in the middle, like Mikki was saying, of this happening right now. Science was sort of born of Christianity, as my first book says, that from Father Iaki's work. Science was born of Christianity. Science exploded. It grew up. It became so independent, like this adolescent that thinks he knows more than his parents and doesn't need them. I think that's kind of where scientism and the atheism came from. But I think we're getting past it now, and that we're actually moving into a period of maturity for science. I think science is sort of coming back to mama, and like the prodigal son. And that the people of our time having conversations like this are bringing about that maturity of science, where it's coming back to its roots in a bigger, richer, better way that will actually progress the human race forward.
Well, this conversation certainly has shed some light and provided some insights into the bringing back of our understanding of how the world works and our understanding of our relationship with God as things that are not incompatible with one another. But that are very much useful to understand as an integrated reality, as a way to not compartmentalize the various aspects of our life, but to live in the fullness of our life. So thank you very much, Stacy. Thank you very much, Mikki, for being with us today. Would you like to give a shout-out to any family members or our friends or colleagues in the world?
My husband and my children would be my first, and then all of my students who have helped me grow as an individual along the way.
And my sweet husband, Jose, and all the kids, Reagan, Max, Abigail, Grace, Marie, Lucy, and JJ.
Well, God bless us all. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today, and we'll see you again next week on WCAT Radio's show Faith and Science in Our Catholic Schools. God bless. We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.